This is module A3. We're going to look at osseous tissue and bone structure. The skeletal system not only includes the bones of the body that we looked at in lab, but it also includes many of the connective tissues associated with bones. Cartilage, for instance. We find on the ends of long bones these cartilaginous pads that help reduce the friction when two long bones come together, when two long bones articulate. Aside from cartilage, we have ligaments that help stabilize bone-on-bone interaction. We find tendons that help hold muscles onto bones. All of these connective tissues fall under this, the skeletal system. In terms of primary functions of the skeletal system, I think it's relatively intuitive that many of you would guess support. The skeletal system supports not only the weight, but the form of our body. Aside from support, the skeletal system serves as a very important storage site for minerals, minerals such as calcium and phosphate, as well as fats. Calcium is the most abundant mineral in our body. It's very important and pivotal in many physiological processes, such as muscular contraction, something that we'll look at in the next module. I think we're told as children to drink milk. It will make your bones strong. It'll make you grow. Well, yes, milk has a very high calcium content, and your mother was right. That calcium is added to your bones. It's stored in your bones. Lipids tend to be stored in the medullary cavity or the bone marrow cavity. We saw in lab how many of your long bones are somewhat hollowed, and that is known as your bone marrow cavity. And at certain times in life, that cavity is filled with adipocytes, and we refer to this as yellow marrow. Red marrow is the site of blood cell production, both red blood cells and white blood cells. The skeletal system serves to protect many of our soft, delicate organs. Our brain and spinal cord are literally encased within the skull and the backbone, the vertebra. Our heart and lungs, found within our thoracic cavity, is surrounded by ribs. So it serves as a very important, it serves to protect many of our soft, delicate organs. Our pelvis, many of our digestive and reproductive organs are nestled down within our pelvis. Lastly, the skeletal system, in conjunction with the muscular system, serves as sites for leverage, force of motion. And again, this is something that we'll look at later in Module 4. In lab, we look at the histology of the bone. Bone is largely composed of a matrix. That matrix is largely composed of calcium salts. We also find cells within that matrix. The osteocytes, or bone cells, again, look at the word, break it down. We have sites for cells, and osteo refers to bone. And osteocytes live within these little depressions, these regions known as lacunae, and they're never far from a blood supply. And again, we saw this in lab in the structure of the osteon. Osteocytes are able to communicate with one another through the canaliculi. The canaliculi are little canals, and I like to use the word canals because the word canaliculi starts with canal. And these are little canals that connect one lacunae to another, and this allows osteocytes to communicate with one another. They exchange nutrients as well as waste products. The bone, as an organ, is surrounded by the periosteum. This is just a covering that surrounds the bone. And if you look at the medullary cavity inside of the bone, it's coated or covered by the endosteum. And both the periosteum and endosteum will be addressed later on in this module. If we look at the matrix itself, the non-living component of bone, we can divide it in two. Here's my relatively straight line. At the top we have the inorganic. And inorganic refers to inorganic refers to the lack of, it's the lack of carbon. So these are compounds or ions that lack carbon. And 2/3 of the bone matrix is composed of calcium phosphate. Here's the structure for calcium phosphate. I don't expect you to memorize the structure, but you should be able to pick out the word calcium phosphate. Two other important calcium salts include calcium hydroxide and hydroxyapatite. The organic component of matrix is largely composed of collagen. Collagen is a protein. It's very flexible, yet very strong. And it's when you combine the inorganic and the organic components of the matrix, you get a substance that is extremely strong, yet flexible. And that's exactly what bone is. It's very strong, yet flexible. Many people look at a bone and they consider it something that is very static. And by static, I mean that it's very non-changing. It's very non-alive, I would think most of you would guess. Bone is very much alive, and it's very dynamic. It changes all the time. Bone is constantly being made and destroyed all at the same time. It's being remodeled, and this is something, again, we'll look at later. The cellular component of bone include 4 cell types, and if you look at the total mass of bone, the cells only make up about 2%. So the rest of the weight of bone is found within the matrix, both the inorganic and organic matrix. There are 4 cell types found within bone: the osteocyte, the osteoblast with a B, the osteoprogenitor cells, and the osteoclast with a C. Again, we mentioned that the osteocyte is a mature bone cell, and the main function of the osteocyte is to maintain that matrix, maintain that bony matrix. The osteocyte not only will produce the protein collagen, which it then exports into the matrix, but it also is very important in ossifying that matrix. It adds the calcium salts. Osteocytes do not divide. They are absolutely isolated within those lacunae. Here is a small lacunae. These are the little dark ovoid regions in this histology slide. And radiating from these lacunae are these canaliculi. And remember, the canaliculi are the canals that allow substances to be transported between osteocytes. Another function of the osteocyte is that the osteocyte can serve to help repair damaged bone, and that's something we'll cover later. Osteoblasts with a B, these are immature bone cells that ultimately secrete matrix. If you look at the matrix that osteoblasts secrete, you find that it's uncalcified. There are no, or it lacks calcium. And we refer to this largely organic matrix as the osteoid. So osteoblasts largely produce collagen and deposit it within as the organic component of the matrix. Osteoblasts, once they have pretty much isolated themselves within the matrix, differentiate into osteocytes. Differentiation, and let me spell that word. Differentiate. They turn into osteocytes. Differentiate refers to that change. So osteoblasts ultimately turn into osteocytes once they're isolated within matrix. Third cell type is the osteoprogenitor cells. These are a type of stem cell that ultimately divide and produce osteoblasts. So 3 of these cell types are closely related, and if we were to draw a family tree of sorts, we would put the osteoprogenitor cells at the top, and over time, the osteoprogenitor cells will differentiate into osteoblasts with a B. And again, once those osteoblasts are embedded within matrix, they become or differentiate into osteocytes. The osteoprogenitor cells are located mainly in the endosteum, and they play a very important function in fracture repair. So if a fracture were to occur, the osteoprogenitor cell will migrate to the site of the fracture. It will differentiate into an osteoblast, and the osteoblast will start producing matrix, or the osteoid, which is solely the organic component. So it starts secreting collagen, largely. And once that osteoblast is completely embedded within that matrix, it then differentiates into the osteocyte. So this is kind of how fracture repair or healing works. The last cell that we're going to look at is the osteoclast. And the osteoclast is a very large multinucleated cell. It has many nuclei. And the main role of the osteoclast, the main function, is in the secretion of proteolytic enzymes. Let's look at that word. Proteolytic. Proteo refers to protein, and lytic comes from lysis, and that means to break. So these are protein digesting enzymes. Osteoclasts will essentially dissolve bone matrix, and it does so in order to release some of the stored minerals, such as the calciums and the phosphates, that are being stored there. And it's that release is referred to as osteolysis. Figure 6.3 are the types of bone cells. This kind of gives you a little diagram or picture of what these bone cells look like. Again, here we see all the way over on the left, we have the osteocytes. And these osteocytes are completely embedded within matrix. There's 1 and 2, and they are connected via the canaliculi. Remember, the canaliculi allow for the exchange of nutrients and waste products. And then all the way on the right, we have a very large osteoclast. This is a very large multinucleated cell. All these little circular structures are nuclei. So why do we have cells that build bone and cells that destroy bone? Well, it's all in the maintenance of homeostasis. And homeostasis of what, you might ask? Homeostasis of certain minerals, for instance, like calcium and phosphate. Our body requires a certain level of calcium. calcium is utilized by many other systems in the body. And if our calcium levels drop too low, osteoclasts start secreting their protein digesting enzymes, their proteolytic enzymes, and they release calcium into the bloodstream, and that raises the calcium level. If calcium level gets too high, for instance, osteoblast activity increases, and it puts the calcium back into the bone. So it's a constant battle. Osteoblasts with the B are constantly battling osteoclasts in order to maintain homeostasis. If you have more breakdown, more osteoclast with a C activity than osteoblast activity, bones become weak. They become thinner. On the opposite end exercise. Individuals who go and lift weights, they pump iron. This causes osteoblast activity to increase, and bones become stronger. Bone mass increases.